they do that, but then at the same time, you realize that this becomes the basis for who God calls His people. This becomes the basis of the 12 tribes of Israel and all that because of these actions that were taken. So I believe that shows this God's grace, that when we take things in our own hands and we try to make things happen, God can still use all that for good. But boy, don't we mess up the situation and put ourselves in some bad situations when we try to take situations to our own hands. So, title of the message this afternoon is "Trying to Get Ahead of God." Trying to get ahead of God, and we're all subject to do this. I'm certainly not without fault in this area. All of us start thinking about things that we want to happen in our life or in our job or at our house or whatever, and we start thinking, man, I need to make this happen. And there are sometimes, obviously, we got to do the work, we got to have a plan, we got to do all these things. But the main thing that we got to do is wait on the Lord. Okay, we got to wait for His time, and we need to have patience. And we can do the work, and we can try to make things happen. But if we're not careful, we'll do like Rachel and Leah here, and we will take situations to our own hand and try to get ahead of God. Now, this whole story, the whole story of Jacob and Laban and Rachel and Leah and the whole situation, all the way down to Joseph and all that, like really what I find is that this whole story becomes just one big example of trying to get ahead of God and the kind of complications that we make for ourselves and the bad situations that we get into. So I want to use this whole story and talk about just 3 areas of life that we all can be tempted to not wait on God and not wait for His timing and to do right, and we can try to get ahead of God. And I see this in our society all the time. As a pastor, I see it in the lives of people in the church, and again, it's not meant from a critical eye. It's not meant to be judgmental and all. We all fall into these things and want to take matters into our own hands. But this is a caution. I think that God would want us to consider these things and in our own lives, put them into practice and just be reminded of these stories and what happens. Now, number one, we could see this from the very beginning of the story, not waiting on God for the right spouse. Not waiting on God for the right spouse. Go to Genesis 29, if you would. Genesis 29, and start there in verse 16. And Laban had 2 daughters. Now, if you don't remember the story, Jacob goes, he's fled from home, and he goes to his uncle's house, basically, and there's where he's seeking a job opportunity and a place to go, and he comes across family, and ends up, the story, ends up working for him. But Laban said unto Jacob, let's start with 15, because thou art my brother, shouldest thou therefore serve me for naught? Yet tell me, what shall thy wages be? And Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah was tender-eyed. Now, I don't know where that term comes from, but it's not good, okay? You didn't want to be called the person that's tender-eyed. Some people say that describes her look, what she looked like. It had something to do with her. Maybe she had a bad eye or something. I don't know. I think it was like, that you've heard it put the other way, like that person is easy on the eyes, meaning that they look good. I think maybe the idea is that it's tender to your eyes to look upon her, okay? Maybe that's what it's saying. But whatever the case, the Bible is like politely saying that she wasn't so great looking, okay? But Rachel was beautiful and well favored. And Jacob loved Rachel and said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel, thy younger daughter. And Laban said, it is better that I give her to thee than I should give her to another man. Abide with me. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel. And isn't this a great love story? And it seemed unto him but a few days for the love he had for her. And Jacob said unto Laban, give me my wife, for the days are fulfilled, that I may go in unto her. And Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. And it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah his daughter and brought her to him. And he went in unto her, and Laban gave unto his daughter, unto him his daughter Leah. And Laban gave unto his daughter Leah Zilpah, his maid, for an handmaid. And it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, what is this that thou hast done unto me? Did not I serve with thee for Rachel? Wherefore why then hast thou beguiled me? And Laban said, it must not be so done in our country, to give the younger before the firstborn. Now look, Laban was a scoundrel. That was a rotten thing to do. Okay, there's no doubt about that. I think we can all have sympathy on that situation. I'm a little bit curious. I've always been curious when I read this story, like how it got that far. How did Jacob go in and consummate the marriage and not know that this wasn't Rachel? But I don't know. I don't know the customs. I don't know. Maybe their head was covered or something. I don't know the story. But all I know is that when he gets up in the morning, he sees that it's Leah, and he's not happy with the situation. Now, this is going to be a really hard thing to say, because we all love a good love story. We all love this whole, man, I will work for her. She's just so beautiful to me, and I love her so much. I'll work for 7 years, and it was just but a few days because of the love that he had for her. He didn't mind working for her and all that stuff. But I'm going to say something that would almost be offensive, and that is this. I believe God's plan was for Jacob to marry Leah. Now, I know that sounds rough, and I am not discounting the fact that what Laban did here was rotten. Okay, he shouldn't have done it that way. But perhaps the whole thing started with the fact that Jacob just saw someone that was beautiful and said, I got to have her. And he just kind of rushed into things and said, hey, I'll work for you for 7 years for her. And I don't know how much they actually courted and saw each other during that time, or how that actually played out. But as I read along the narrative and I continue on the story, I find that Leah is obviously the one that God blesses and begins having children right away. Rachel doesn't. Leah is the one who has the son Judah, which, as you know, becomes the line from which Christ is born. And so there is a blessing there that obviously God knew something about and was going on. And so I just feel like when I read this story, maybe had Jacob been patient. You ever notice how maybe there's people in your life that you met, and when you first looked at them, you didn't necessarily think that they were attractive people, but as you begin spending time with them and you get to know them, it's like, man, they increasingly get more attractive to you because you get to know their personality and all that. And the opposite's true. Sometimes you see somebody and you just think that they're like the best looking person. Once you get to know them and their personality, all of a sudden they disgust you, and you can't, you don't want anything to do with them or whatever. Again, I'm reading into this a little bit. I understand that, but just thinking about the fact how God blesses Leah and how God brings Jesus from her line, basically, and not Rachel's, makes me think that God's original plan was that he would be with Leah. Now, I don't know about the custom. Like, that's not the way we do things here. You have to have the oldest wife. And back then, obviously, we understand in the Bible, like, polygamy was kind of accepted to some degree, even in the law. God makes allowance for it. And certainly there's nowhere where he ever says that it's right, but he knows people are going to do that. So he says, if they do that, then here's the things that they have to follow. I don't think anybody in here would say like, well, I think it was just God's plan for Jacob to just be a polygamist and have both wives and all this kind of stuff. I don't think that we would come to that conclusion. And really, how long does it take to read this story and say like, it probably wasn't a good idea to have 2 wives and to have children with both wives and all this stuff. And it ends up being really bad. You can continue the story and read what happens with all the jealousy in between the families and all the fighting, and then end up trying to kill Joseph and all this kind of stuff. Now, again, in the end, God works it out for good. And it ends up being God's people, although there sure is a whole lot of bad things that happen and death and destruction and all that kind of stuff that takes place as a result of it too. But of course, God, anytime somebody is born or anytime somebody gets married or whatever, like God's naturally going to bring, if they have a heart for him and they love him and they're trying to do right, God's going to bring good from that. And just for his own purposes, sometimes he'll allow things to happen so that he can be praised and honored from it. But that doesn't mean that what they did was right. Okay, and so the first thing we see here is that Jacob he just has his eyes on Rachel, and I don't believe he stopped to consider God's will. I don't think he gave it time. I don't think he tried to find out, why God had him there, or who Leah was, or get to know him. And by all means, I am not saying that being attracted to a person isn't an important part of marriage, okay? Because, I wouldn't want to say like that's not important. You want to be attracted to the person that you're going to marry and be with for the rest of your life, okay? But too many people forget the big picture. They don't dig deeper, and they don't get to know that person before they engage in marriage. And I see it all the time. Now, once they're married, there's nothing they can do. So we got to encourage them to stay together and to get over the hurdles that they might go through and the problems that they might have with each other. But man, they should have spent a little bit of time searching, is this God's will, before they get married. 2 Corinthians 6:14 says, Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, but what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness, and what communion hath light with darkness? You say, what are you trying to say? Rachel was an unbeliever? Hey, I can't say this for sure, but here's what I know. Later on, she steals her father's idols. Whenever Jacob leaves and he takes his family, she steals his idols. I got to have those idols, and takes them with him. I don't know if Rachel was a believer in Jehovah or not, but she obviously makes some bad decisions and all that kind of stuff. I'm just putting those things out there as an example. Okay, so number one, here's just an example: marrying an unbeliever or a worldly Christian. Okay, maybe they're a believer, but maybe they're worldly. There's some things that they hold on to, they don't want to give up, and you're thinking, because you're in love or in lust or whatever the case, you're thinking like, well, I'll change them, I'll make them different, God will change their heart, and then you just enter up into this marriage. And a lot of times people find out real quickly that it doesn't get better, it typically gets worse. And so you want to seek the right match. You don't want to be unequally yoked, and you want to find that right person. Here's another example, though. Here's what some Christians do. They grow up in church, and they don't know, where am I going to find a spouse? And so they say, well, there's only one solution. I got to go to Bible college. That's where I got to find my spouse. I wouldn't tell you how many times people have said to Sharice, like, you're not going to go to Bible college? Like, how do you plan on ever finding a husband? Right? How do you finding a husband? I mean, you don't have a whole bunch of men in your church to start with. Look, we didn't know what was going to happen, and I know they're not married yet, but God brought two people together, and we didn't plan on that, but we didn't. She didn't get ahead of God and say like, well, come on, Mom and Dad, that's the only way I'm going to find a spouse. I got to go off to Bible college. Now, look, if someone goes off to Bible college and they find a godly spouse there, praise the Lord. I'm certainly not saying that there's anything wrong with that. But here's what I'm saying is that to think that way and to put God in a box and be like, hey, the only way I'm going to do it is if I go, you're already starting on a wrong basis. You're already getting yourself ahead of God, and you're trying to figure out what you need in your life and how you're going to make things, and writing out all the plans for your life without considering, what does God want in my life? And it could be, quite honestly, sometimes God intends for somebody to be single. Now, the Bible talks about, hey, it's not for everybody. It's a hard thing, and some people cannot be single. I understand that. But there are some people that I feel like maybe God wants them to be single, but they say, hey, you don't understand what it's like. And so they go and they get married, and then they find out that, hey, maybe being single was a little bit better than the marriage that they get themselves into. This is just the reality. Again, not judging, not calling anybody out, calling any names. I'm just saying that this is something that we can get from this biblical principle, and it's something that I do see happens regularly. Number two, just three very basic things, okay, that people find themselves in these situations trying to get ahead of God. Number two, not waiting on God for children. Not waiting on God for children. Go to chapter 30. Of course, we already read this part right here, but let's read the first 5 verses. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said unto Jacob, give me children or else I die. Can you imagine being Jacob? Like, what am I? Like, I can't give you children. I mean, it's not my fault. And she's upset. Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? He's like, God's the one that's closed your womb. I don't understand why, but that's the reality, okay? But she's looking at Leah, and she's seeing Leah's having children, and she's like, oh, he's going to love Leah more, and Leah's going to be blessed, and I don't get children, and it's just not fair, and she's getting upset. So what does she do? She takes matters into her own hands, and she said, behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, and I may also have children by her. How many of you think that was a great idea? And how many of you thinking, like, what was Jacob thinking by agreeing to that? Like, how is that gonna end up being a good situation? Now, here's the reality. Bilhah ends up having children, and Rachel's like, yay, I have a child. Right? Now, somebody could say, now look, are you saying that she shouldn't have done that? I mean, look at this child that she had. Are you saying that that child shouldn't be there? Have you ever heard that kind of reasoning? All right, so you got two people, they commit fornication. They don't get married, but they had sex before marriage, and they end up having a child, and the person tells me, like, I don't regret doing that because look at this child. You mean to tell me that that wasn't God's will that I have this wonderful child? And I'm saying, do you mean it was God's will to have fornication? Right? Because I could say the same thing. All right, this man rapes this woman, and then she has a child, and was it God's will that she was raped? And the women of today would be like, what are you talking about? No. In fact, she should be able to commit abortion if she wants to, because it wasn't her fault that this man raped her and all this kind of stuff. Whoa, that's a double standard, isn't it? What they're saying is, hey, we get to decide what the result's going to be. We get to decide this, and whenever it happens, then all of a sudden it was God's will. But the reality is, sometimes God allows things to happen because of the actions that we take, but it doesn't mean it was God's original will. Now that it's the case, again, God can bring good from it, and God can work out according to his own purposes and plans. But don't get this Calvinistic idea that said, well, God must have just wanted this sin to happen, right? He just elected that this would happen so that this child would be born and all this stuff. That's not how it works. In fact, I remember thinking this through one time and talking with my wife about that. And the reality is, when those situations happen, here's what happens if you think about it. When a person does these kinds of things, what they're essentially doing is robbing from God. God didn't tell them to do it that way. God said, don't commit fornication. God said, don't commit adultery. God said, don't do all these things. And so when a person takes it in their hands and says, well, I know God says that, but, and then they get a blessing and they say, oh, look, God gave me this blessing. No, he didn't give it to you. You stole it from him, without permission. Now that you have it, and God might bless that, but that doesn't mean that was God's will for you. I hope that kind of makes sense. So in this story, of course, we have, Leah, she's having children, Rachel's jealous, and of course, down the road, Rachel does end up having children. She has Joseph and she has Benjamin, okay? She has Joseph, which ends up, now, yes, he spares the people in the end, I understand that, but the brothers hate him. And the whole time they're envious of him. They end up trying to kill him and all that kind of stuff. She has Joseph because why? Because all these brothers are living together, and some of them have Leah for their mom, and some of them have Leah's handmaid, because later on Leah does the same thing. And then some of them have Rachel, and then some of them have Rachel's handmaid, and Jacob preferred Rachel, so obviously he dotes on Joseph and Benjamin, which, by the way, she dies whenever she has Benjamin. And so, like, she brings two children into the world. One is hated. Yes, God blesses him, I understand that. But he was hated. And then the other one, she dies whenever he's born. And it was like, this was her, what came of all this fighting over, who's going to have children, and I've got to use my handmaid here to get more children. And so you had all this envying and strife within the family, and all these bad things that happened. Now, again, in the situation, 12 children, and they hate each other. What should the mom and dad have done? Well, obviously, they should have raised their kids as godly children, and they should have followed the Lord, and they should have stopped these things from happening the best they could, and all those kinds of things. But the reality is, they were the ones that brought this on to themselves. One example is obviously going in and like premarital sex, or trying to get somebody, okay, you're like, hey, I want to, I don't know, did I tell you the second point? The second point is not waiting on God for children, okay? So one idea is like, hey, I really want to have children, and so I'm going to go do that. Some people today will take various substances to try to help them to be more fertile or whatever. I don't even know how all that works, but some people would do that. Look, this sounds familiar too. Look at chapter 30, verse 14. Oh, I know what I was going to say. Doesn't this also sound familiar? Because if you remember back a few chapters, Abraham and Sarah do the same thing. Sarah can't have a child, so what does she do? Like, hey, take my my bondmaid Hagar, and then they try to do the same thing, and then she has a child, and what happens? Sarah is jealous, and Sarah's upset, and then eventually she has a child, and she casts the bondwoman out, and again, God uses that as a picture, and He uses it in the Bible. It's quoted again, but that doesn't mean that God wouldn't have done things differently had they made the right choice and followed God's will. All right, so let's give some examples of people today trying to get ahead of God when it comes to not waiting for children. Chapter 30, verse 14. And Reuben went in the days of the wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field and brought them unto his mother Leah. Then Rachel said unto Leah, Give me, I pray thee, of thy son's mandrakes. And she said unto her, Is it a small matter that thou hast taken my husband, and wouldest thou take away my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, Therefore he shall lie with thee tonight for thy son's mandrakes. She's selling out her husband, right? It's weird. The whole situation is weird, and Jacob is the one to blame for all this. And Jacob came out of the field in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him and said, Thou must come in unto me, for surely I have hired thee for my son's mandrakes. And he lay with her that night. Now, what is a mandrake? No idea. I don't know. The only thing I know about a mandrake is this tree that grows out by the water, and the roots go way down. I don't know if you've ever seen that. I don't know what it's talking about, but apparently you study out the terminology that's used in the Hebrew and all this kind of stuff. They say that it had to do with something that it's called like the love apple or something like that. That supposedly, I don't speak Hebrew, but all we know is that there was something significant about this. It was some kind of substance or something that was believed to help women to produce or to help something along those lines. And so he gets this for his mother and says, Hey, look. And then Rachel says, Hey, you think those would work? I want some of those. And so it's really strange. But what it has to do with, like, instead of relying on God, waiting for God, who is going to eventually open up her womb and she's going to have children, but she doesn't wait. And so she's trying to find another way. Let me give some substance. Let me give something in here that will help me increase fertility or whatever. Some women today use surrogate mothers. And again, I don't understand all these things. I haven't dealt into all the details. But here is in a nutshell. They'll have another woman carry the child for them so that when it comes to mature, whenever it's born, and then kind of like this situation, she's, when they have their handmaids involved, they say the handmaid will have this child, and then it'll bear the child at my feet, and then I'll take it and raise it up as my child. And so basically it's a surrogate mother. Somebody's going to hold on to that child, and then whenever that child is born, it becomes the other person's child. Now, I would imagine that causes problems too, because the person that was carrying the child probably has this motherly natural instinct that's going to wonder why, their body's going to wonder why that child's not hers, and then they just pass it on. Probably going to have repercussions on the child when they grow up. I don't know. Again, I'm not trying to make a scientific study on how these things are wrong. The point I'm trying to make in this message is too many people are trying to get ahead of God, and they're saying, well, I don't know why God didn't give me this, so I'm going to do X, Y, Z. Now, another one is something I haven't studied a whole lot, but perhaps many in here have, I don't know, but it's in vitro fertilization. In vitro fertilization, the way I understand it is basically they will take the eggs, from a woman using modern technology. They take the eggs from a woman, and they will fertilize them, either using the man's sperm if he can, or if not, they'll find somebody else who can contribute, and they'll fertilize these eggs. And then they'll take of the eggs the ones who look like the best possible, success, and they'll keep those and discard the other ones. Okay, and so like right away, whenever I read that, And yeah, look it up, and it is a lot of people struggle with is this ethical? Is this right? And so when I look at that right away, and my wife was using this when we were talking about this, she was using this as an example. Whenever you plant, plants into the ground, a lot of times you'll plant several of them together at the same time. And when they start to come up, you'll say, hey, that one is growing really good. I want to keep that one. And you'll pluck the other one out, and you pluck the other one out. Right away, whenever you see that, like say a woman has like 6 eggs, that are fertilized or whatever, and it's like, well, we're just going to keep this one, or the records show that this one might have a deformity or something like that, and so they discard those. In my mind, I'm thinking, well, how is that any different than the concept of abortion, right? Because you're thinking like, well, I just don't think that one is going to fit my needs or whatever, and so you discard that. Now, the argument could be made, well, it wasn't really a life yet. Okay, well, now you got that whole argument about abortion. If you believe life is at conception, then really in vitro fertilization is kind of getting into an unethical situation, right? So recently, somebody online, we kept getting these notifications saying, hey, so-and-so is raising all this money. They found out that they can't have children, and they're really sad. And so, the way we understand it, like the original thing that they were saying was, so they're going to adopt. And so everybody was contributing money. Hey, we want them to adopt, whatever. And then it changed to actually their doctor said they're going to do in vitro fertilization. And when I saw that, I thought, well, here they are asking people for money. A lot of people are like, oh, I'm so glad that they're going to work something out and they're going to be able to have children. And I thought, I don't think these people are thinking through the ethical ramifications of this, and I don't know what's going on. But I didn't want to be offensive, and so I was like, man, I really wonder like what the justification is out there. And so I put on Facebook a post that I took down right away because somebody made it very clear that this upset them. And you say, well, you're just a wimp. No, I just don't want to be a jerk. Okay. And so I said, okay, the timing's probably bad. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. But I put something out there, and I tried to politely say it this way. Hey, this is a situation that many are familiar with. A lot of people were tagged in this post. A lot of people had contributed money to this procedure. And I was like, so what I'm trying to figure out is from a Christian perspective of somebody who is anti-abortion. They believe life begins at conception, and they believe in the sanctity of marriage. So the person that you're married to is the person that you have a child with and all that stuff. What are the justifications? Because all these friends and Bible college students and all that are contributing money to this and saying, hey, this is a good thing. And I'm thinking, maybe they don't know what in vitro fertilization is, or maybe I misunderstand. And so I put this out there. What is the justification for a Christian doing that without the ethical ramification? Of course, the person that's raising the money and all that gets on there and just says, take this off. It's inappropriate, and how dare you, and blah, blah, and you don't know what these people are going through. And I'm like, you know what? Rather than arguing with her, I'm just going to take it down. And then, then I got some private messages about it and all this kind of stuff. And basically what it came down to, here's the thing that was said. Well, for you, it must be really nice. You guys can just have children whenever you want. This person can't have children, and so they're seeking other alternatives to have children. And my first thought was like, I know it might be rough, but maybe God doesn't want them to have children, and that's why he shut up the womb. Maybe that's why they're not maybe God doesn't want them to have children. How dare you say such a thing? Am I in the place of God? Can I shut the womb or open the womb? That's not the issue. Well, yeah, but we should be able to do this. So what you're saying is, so you should be able to get ahead of God and decide what is best for you and what you want. And in the process, by your definition of life begins at conception, you are actually possibly executing children, and you're doing all this. But again, I tried to have this. I wanted somebody to tell me what their side of the story, but they didn't want to have the conversation because they said, it's not fair. You have children, they don't. You can't talk. Well, if that's the case, I might look at somebody who's got $1 million and be like, boy, it should be nice. It might be nice to. I don't know. Is $1 million even anything anymore? Everyone's talking about billionaires. What does Musk have now? Like 200 billion, maybe more than that. It might be doubled by now. I don't know. Billionaires. I can't even fathom a million. In fact, often I'm excited if I'm a thousandaire. It's like, woo, I got $1,000 in the bank. Doesn't happen very often, but if it does, I feel like somebody. Okay, as a thousandaire thing, I don't know. So if I could look at somebody as a millionaire and say, well, it must be nice to just go out and buy whatever you want. I don't think it's fair that I don't have those things. And so I should be able to get some of your money, or I should be able to get some money. And I think we should raise the price of minimum wage so that I can have more. See, this is the philosophy of the world. And what they're saying is, hey, somebody needs to give me something. I should be able to get something that God didn't necessarily want me to have. And this is called trying to get ahead of God, and it's dangerous. I'm not calling that person out who's doing it. I don't even know them. I don't know them that well. I know their name. I know that they went to Bible college where I go to Bible college, but I don't know them that well. I don't know anybody in this church or anybody, other friends of mine in other churches who are going through this procedure. It's just something that came up, and I said, whoa, I was thinking that was an unethical thing, and so I wanted to talk about it. But the reality is, it doesn't really matter what the science is. It doesn't matter whether they're hurting somebody or not hurting somebody. Here's one thing I know, is that it looks to me like this is another case of somebody trying to get ahead of God. Now again, are you being judgmental? Look, I try to get ahead of God, I'm sure, all the time on different things, not waiting on God. I try to go do something that wasn't His plan, wasn't His will. I see churches do it all the time, trying to get ahead of God. Well, we don't have enough people here. We got to figure out a way to get more people in the church. So they go out and take matters in their own hands, and they say, well, I'm going to do it this way, that way. Well, the Bible didn't say to do those things. That's being like the world or whatever. But this is just a natural thing that we try to take things in our own hands and get ahead of God. So I already got into the financial thing a little bit as an example, but number 3, that's actually another thing, not waiting on God to provide for you financially. This is rough, because if you, again, each one of these situations, somebody in here, I'm sure, could put themselves in there and say, well, man, you don't know what it's like to not be married and to wish you were married. Man, you don't know what it's like to not have children and to wish you could have children. But you can't tell me I don't know about this one. No, I'm just kidding. Not waiting on God to provide for you financially. I do know what that feels like, to be like, God, I don't know. Right now, I'm not really in this situation, but there's times in my life where I'm like, God, I'm in Bible college. I'm doing what you want me to do. I'm raising a family and all this stuff, and I don't know how I'm going to pay the bills for the week. Most of us have been there. Most of us understand that feeling. And it's just like, well, what am I going to do? I've got to go figure out a way to make more money. Now, look, you have a responsibility. Men especially, you got a responsibility to work. If a man doesn't work, you shouldn't eat. And you got to go out there, you got to provide for your family and all those kinds of things. But sometimes we can begin to take God's will into our own hands and figure out a way to make money. Look at, look at chapter 30, verse 28. Chapter 30, verse 28. So at the end of this time, Laban's given both of his daughters, and he's worked 14 years now. He has both daughters, and he says, appoint me thy wages, and I will give it. Let's start with verse 26. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served thee, and let me go, for thou knowest my service which I have done for thee. And Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thine eyes, tarry, for I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake. And he said, appoint me thy wages, and I will give it. And he said unto him, thou knowest how I have served thee, and how thy cattle was with me. For it was little which thou hast before I came, and it is now increased unto a multitude. And the Lord hath blessed thee since my coming, and now when shall I provide for my own house also? And he said, what shall I give thee? And Jacob said, thou shalt not give me anything, if thou wilt do this thing for me. I will again feed and keep thy flock. I will pass through all thy flock today, removing from thence all the speckled and spotted cattle, and all the brown cattle among the sheep, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and of such shall be my hire. So shall my righteousness answer for me in time to come, when it shall come for my hire before thy face. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats, and brown among the sheep, that shall be counted stolen with me. And Laban said, behold, I would it might be according to thy word. Now Laban's probably thinking, hey, it's either going to be spotted or speckled, or it's not going to be 50-50 chance. And so you'll get some of what you raise, and I'll get the others, and it'll be probably split pretty even. But I don't know if Jacob knew really the science behind what he was fixing to do. But You know, I've heard people try to explain how it works. I don't completely understand. But here's what I know, that it ends up working in his favor. God obviously blesses, and he or I guess you call it blesses, and he wanted Jacob to have this. But here's the thing that I think is interesting. Jacob took, look at verse 37. And Jacob took him rods of green poplar and of the hazel and chestnut tree, and peeled, you can think of the word peeled, same idea. He peeled white streaks in them and made the white appear which was in the rod. And he set the rod which he had peeled before the flocks in the gutter, in the watering troughs, when the flocks came to drink, that they should conceive when they came to drink. And the flocks conceived before the rods, and brought forth cattle, ring-straked, speckled, and spotted. And Jacob did separate the lambs, and set the faces of the flocks toward the ring-stake, and all the brown in the flock of Laban, and he put his own flocks by themselves, and put them not unto Laban's cattle. And it came to pass, whensoever the stronger cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid the rods before the eyes of the cattle in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the cattle were feeble, he put them not in, so the feebler with Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. And the man increased exceedingly, and had much cattle, and maidservants, and men servants, and camels and asses. Now, I'm suspecting that from a scientific standpoint, you can look at what he did and say, hey, it's just a matter of I can't even think of the word right now, like crossbreeding or whatever. You know, it's just a matter of how genetics works or whatever. Like, I don't know. But here's the question I want to say. So he took this branch, poplar and then the hazel or whatever, took this branch. So imagine it got a little branch has bark on it. And so he peels off these little spots and rings on the poplar branch or the hazel branch or whatever, and he peels them off. So he's got this rod now that has bark, and then it's got little spots where there's no bark. And he puts that in the feeding trough, and he thinks, all right, if the cattle look at that and they conceive, they're going to conceive spotted and straked and ring-straked cattle. How many of you guys think that's scientific? They just look at this thing here, and you know what it sounds like to me? An old wives' tale. You know what I mean? An old wives' tale. Like, I'm just going to do this, and if they look at it, then hey, they'll produce. I don't know the science behind it, but it works. You know, you've ever heard somebody say that? Here's what I think about the rods there. I don't think they had anything to do with it. I think God blessed accordingly. Maybe there was some science behind how they cross produce. I actually don't understand all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, I believe that the rod was nothing. It was just something that Jacob wanted to throw in there as kind of a good luck charm, okay, or this idea of, oh, maybe this will work. Maybe this will work. And here's the thing. You don't need superstitious practices. You know, you don't need good luck charms. You don't need all these kinds of things to help you financially. I knew this guy, he was actually from Kenya. I don't know if that makes any difference or not, because people in the United States are just as superstitious probably to some degree as they are in Kenya. But he was originally from Kenya, and I remember he told me this. He said he always kept $1 bill in his wallet. And he said, well, as long as I have $1 bill, I'll never be poor. And I said, that doesn't make any sense. And I was like, okay, I see what you're saying. Because you'll always have $1. So you'll never be completely poor because you'll always have that $1. He's like, no, having that $1 is going to keep me from financial failure. And so it's like basically kept that $1 in there as like a good luck charm. And I was like, that doesn't make any sense. But I guess if you're superstitious, if you think, hey, this is the same guy also that said he doesn't ever clips his fingernails because he's afraid somebody's going to get his fingernails and put a curse on him, okay? So that's kind of like I talked about enchantment this morning in Sunday school. That's the kind of dark magic stuff that goes on in Africa. And by the way, here in the United States as well. So let me give you a couple examples. People getting ahead of God, wanting to be financially prosperous, okay? How about this? In among those who claim to be Christians, I'm not going to say they're all Christians, but those who claim to be Christians, we have the wealth and prosperity gospel that's being taught, okay? And this will manifest itself in many ways. You hear them all the time, and they come across as kind of like these get-rich schemes. So it's like, well, if you send us the seed money, and we're going to pray for you, and God's going to do this great miracle for you, and the more money you send us, the greater the miracle God's going to do for you. Do you know how many people fall for that? I mean, these guys are getting rich. How do you think those guys get all that money, and they got the jet planes, and they got the fancy suits, and they got the cars, and the multi-million or billion-dollar mansions, stuff like that? Because they know that people are going to fall for this stuff, and people are like, well, what's it going to hurt? Might as well try it. You say, well, I don't know. Are people that dumb? Now, if you buy lottery tickets, forgive me. But every time I go in the gas station, it seems like somebody's up there. Just give me a couple of those lottery tickets. And I'll take the cherry bomb over there, and I'll take I don't even know what they're called, but I'll take these different things. And there's always, not always, but sometimes there's like this uncomfortable, like almost feeling guilty about it. And so it never ceases to amaze me. Like they start this conversation with the cashier, and they kind of start joking about it. They're just like, well, yeah, I mean, I saw that the Powerball, probably totally different thing. Whatever the lottery's up to like $200 million or something like that. I guess it's worth a shot. Yeah, I figure what's a few dollars going to hurt? Just throw some dollars at that, and maybe I'll get that lottery ticket that'll be the winning number or whatever. You know what gambling is? Gambling is trying to get ahead of God and try to like find a way, like just maybe I'm crossing my fingers and all the superstitious things you can think about. I'm wearing my lucky baseball cap or whatever, just hoping that I'm going to have the magic number, and I use my lucky number, and I use this, that. Look, Christians shouldn't be doing that kind of stuff. There's no place for it. There's no place for it, because what you're actually doing is you're trying to get ahead of God. And it's no different in the wealth and prosperity gospel. Look, I believe that people ought to serve God. They ought to be faithful to God. I believe people ought to give tithes and offerings, right? I think that's a biblical thing to do. But I don't sit here and preach about it all the time. Here's one thing that you won't catch me doing. Well, the more you'll give to God, the more He's going to pour out a blessing on you. Now, I can take you to some scriptures in the Bible where I could really twist that and make you feel like, man, I need to give a little bit more, so maybe God will give me more. Well, that's a bad motive. That's a bad motive to do something for the Lord. How about you just do the Lord, give to the Lord because you're faithful and you love to be in the house of God and you love to serve Him. You like to see that money contribute to the different things that are going on in the church, and you want to contribute to that. And if you can't, you don't. And nobody throws a fit about it, okay? Unless we can't spend any money because nothing's coming in, then I might make a plea. I've never had to do it yet, and say, hey, nobody's giving any money, and so therefore we can't pay the rent, can't do all this. Then we'll have to work. Then we'll have to think about it. But in the meantime, people just give as the Lord lays upon their heart, or they give out of conviction because they feel like they should give 10% of their increase, or whatever the case. But I'm not going to sit up here and preach and twist people's arms and try to make them think that if you give a little bit more, God's really going to bless your life. And they tell these great stories about somebody they knew that gave up all them. I know this guy, and he said, I'm not going to give 10%. I'm going to live off 10%, and I'm going to give 90%. And he became this multi-millionaire, and everyone's at the altar calls thinking, man, I'm going to start living off of 10%. And then 2 weeks from now, they're complaining because they're dirt poor and they can't feed their family and all this kind of stuff. Don't try to get ahead of God and try to find ways to get rich quick schemes and all this kind of stuff. Just work, be faithful, be right with God, pray to God for help and for wisdom, and let Him give you comfort to be able to do the things that He intends for you to do, and to be content with the things that you have. What all of this stuff comes down to is usually covetousness. I want children. It's not right for me not to have children when these people have children. I want more money. It's not right for me to be poor when all these people have money. I want to be married to the perfect spouse. Well, guess what? Those spouses, like all those married people, are thinking there's no such thing as a perfect spouse. Okay? You live in a fantasy world thinking that I want what that person has, and you don't even understand. Just get what God gives you and accept it and be happy with it, whatever case it may be. You say, well, that's easy for you to say. Well, I'm just preaching the Bible. Okay, so here's a conclusion. Let me say about the riches real quick. Proverbs 28:22 says, he that hasteth to be rich hath an evil eye, and considereth not that poverty shall come upon him. He hasteth to be rich. He just wants to be rich. He wants to have more money and to do these things, and so he'll go after it, whatever it takes, and he'll end up losing everything. So in conclusion, let me give you this little statement. Don't rob from God what He didn't want you to have. Okay, it's really easy for us to do. We don't think about it. Maybe God didn't want me to have that. And we try to force God to give us something. Like, don't rob from God what he didn't want you to have. And don't give God what he didn't want you to give. All right, there are sometimes people will feel this pressure to do something for God or to give something to God that he never asked for. And sometimes it'll lead people into sinning, actually sinning, and be like, well, I'm doing it for God. In the story where this verse comes from, where Samuel says to obey is better than sacrifice. I love that verse. Now I try to remind myself of that a lot. Not trying to give him a hard time, but I know a guy, and you know him too, but he's into piercings and tattoos and all that stuff, and it seems like they always growing. He's always getting more. And the other day I was like, man, you got some cellophane on your arms. He just got a tattoo and had a cellophane. He's like, yeah, I know you don't like them. He's like, but I used to shoot up in this arm and cut in this arm and all this kind of stuff. And so I want to get this tattoo so that it'll remind me that I'm serving God now, and I won't ever want to go back to that. And I've quoted this verse to him many times. I've said, hey, to obey is rather than sacrifice. Don't sacrifice that. Well, I'm just doing this for God. I'm just doing this for God. God didn't ask you to do it. He didn't ask you to do it. In fact, I take you to some verses that say, don't make any marks in the body. Don't cut yourself. All right. What you're doing is cutting yourself. Well, I don't want to cut myself anymore. And so I'm going to get a tattoo. Well, guess what that is? Cutting yourself and putting ink inside the cuts. All right. God didn't ask you to do certain things. In that story where Samuel says that God had told Saul to go out and to kill all the Amalekites, and he comes back, and first of all, he didn't kill all of them, but second of all, he says, Samuel says, hey, I thought you were supposed to kill all the Amalekites and all their animals and their cattle and all that stuff. He's like, how come I hear the bleating of the sheep? How come I hear some sheep in the background? And he's like, well, I killed everybody, but I saved the sheep and all that because I'm going to do a sacrifice to God. And I figured, why destroy all those when I could sacrifice them to God? And the thing is, like, God told you to destroy them. Don't you think God would have provided himself a sacrifice if you would have just obeyed him? But Saul's like, yeah, I think I'll get ahead of God and I'll provide a great sacrifice for him. God wants you to obey. God wants you to be faithful. God wants you to serve him and to love him. And he's going to take care of all the rest. He owns cattle on 1,000 hills, and he will take care of you as well. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for just the things that you give us. And let us not take for granted all the blessings you bestow upon us and the many just luxuries that we have even. And though many times we'll get to a point in our lives where maybe we're unsatisfied and thinking that we want more of something, or that you put us in a bad situation or whatever, Lord, I pray that you help us to learn how to be content with such things as we have, and learn how to be happy and serve you in good times and in bad times. And I pray that you'll just give us that wisdom, give us that faith that we need to be able to trust in you and do that. And we know that in the end of this life, if we get nothing in this life, which probably isn't the case for anybody in here, but if we end up with nothing except misery and woe in this life, we know that we can reap treasures and rewards in heaven for all eternity. So I pray that you'll help us just to think of the things of this world and the things that others count as blessings. Lord, help us just count them as dung, and to serve you with our hearts and put you first in our lives. Help each of us, Lord, myself included. I certainly need this just as much as anybody else. Help us put you first and not to get ahead of you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.